Scotland. Scottish stories of the paranormal are plentiful. It's a place that has a rich and turbulent history, and a land whose very mention of its name invokes images of picturesque fields, golf, kilts, and haggis. The name Scotland also invokes images of a persistent and indomitable people, even in death. Creepy Castle, Aberdeen, Scotland, 2005. Calvin had been working and studying in an apprenticeship for some time and finally received his qualifications as a fire and security engineer. It was a proud moment for Calvin, and it gave him the opportunity to go out and work on his own, doing the job that he'd been trained for. He managed to gain employment, and one of his first jobs was that he was to go to an old castle in the outskirts of Aberdeen to investigate a recurrent fault on a fire alarm panel. Calvin drove out to the location as directed, and when he arrived at the beautiful castle, with its high walls and magnificent towers, he took a moment to admire the building. He went inside and reported to reception as was required for all visitors to the site. The receptionist was expecting him and agreed to take him to where the faulty fire panel was. As they walked along, they small-talked for a short time until Calvin could identify the area where the faulty detector appeared to be. He asked the receptionist if she could show him in which direction he would need to go to find that location, and they climbed the stairs for 4 or 5 minutes to reach the area he needed to be in. Calvin observed his surroundings carefully, and noticed that this was in an attic area with only thin beams to walk along to get to the detector. He set off towards the detector with no issues, but he was trying to fully focus on the beam that he was walking along. Once he reached the device, the receptionist who had been waiting for him started talking to him again. He was around 7 to 10 meters away from the entrance to the attic at this point, he says. As he was perched on this thin beam, he made sure not to look back towards the door to respond to her. The reason for this was that he did not want to lose his footing or his balance on the beam. She started asking Calvin all sorts of questions. General things like what his name was, how old he was, where he lived, and what his hobbies were, and also how long he'd been doing this kind of work for. He chatted along as he worked to be polite. He answered all of her questions, and then continued the conversation by asking her some questions as well. He asked her what her name was and how long she had worked in the castle. After 30 to 40 seconds or so, Calvin still hadn't received an answer. He turned to look at the door where she had been standing a few moments earlier, and she was gone. Calvin thought nothing of it. He assumed that maybe the phone had been ringing or she went away back to her desk to do some work. He continued working and eventually finished up what he was doing and headed back across the beam and back down the spiralling staircase. He made his way back out to the reception desk. On arriving back to the desk, he asked the receptionist jokingly, "Did my questions bore you that much that you ran off?" The receptionist looked up at him, very confused. She told him that she had left him immediately after he started making his way across the first beam. He stood in absolute silence, thinking and hoping she was joking with him. It was an awkward silence for a few moments, and eventually he told her that he didn't believe what she had told him. She insisted that she hadn't remained behind with him, and so he asked to see the CCTV from reception. Strangely enough, she agreed to allow him to see the video, and sure enough, within a few minutes of his arrival at reception, the CCTV footage showed the receptionist sitting back at her desk. Confused and a little frightened, Calvin then had the receptionist explain that he wasn't the first workman to come work on the castle and have an experience like this. It had happened a few times before that a workman would return from a job and ask where she had disappeared to, or if anyone else was working in the castle at the same time. According to her explanation, there had been numerous sightings of a young woman who it's assumed was murdered in the castle in the late 1800s. This raised so many questions for Calvin, Then who was it that he was speaking to for all that time? Regardless of who or what it was, he never returned to visit that castle again. I would love to hear from you all about your own paranormal experiences. Our email details are at the end of the show and in the description. Noisy Neighbour, Canryan, Scotland, circa 2011. Eden and her husband lived in New Zealand and had been planning a trip to Scotland for some time. They decided to finally take the plunge and they booked their plane tickets. Once they were there, they decided that they would stay at various places, and this being their first ever trip to Scotland, they wanted to stay at some old pubs. One such pub they decided to stay at was at a village called Canryan, which is on the west side of Scotland and overlooks Loch Ryan. It's known for its large modern ferry port. The roof was very low in the building, which was typical for the time that the old dwellings were built. However, the room was nice and comfortable. They went and had their dinner, and at the close of the evening retired for the night. It was suddenly, at 12 midnight, that loud music started up in the room next door to them. Having been woken up so abruptly, and just wanting to go back to sleep, they thumped on the wall annoyed, so as to make a point of it. But this just didn't work. The music was still playing loudly. Eden's husband was so irritated by this that he got out of bed, got dressed, and went out into the hallway and knocked on the door of the room where all the noise was coming from. He received no answer at the door and no reaction from the occupants of the room. He started to shout out, "Could you turn down the TV, please?" Still no response. Another man then came out of the opposite room, obviously also having been awoken by all the noise, and he too knocked on the door of the noisy room. He also called out, but there was no reaction from the occupants of the room. Loud noises could be heard from that room for about 3 hours, and Eden said that it sounded like a television was on, really loudly. Then, it would suddenly go off, and then it would come back on, always loudly, and in random intervals, which would understandably make you very irritable if you had to listen to that all night. This went on and on, the blaring noises coming from inside that room, over and over again, so much so that every time they tried to settle back to sleep, they would just be woken up again. This happened until about 4 a.m. that night, and then suddenly, it went dead quiet. A few hours later at breakfast, they bumped into the other man that had also come out the night before to knock on the door. They had a quick conversation and he commented to them on how noisy the people in that other room had been the night before. Later that morning, when they were checking out of the accommodation, quite tired and a little bit irritated, they mentioned the incident to the pub owner at reception. They asked who had been in the room next door to them, and the owner looked at her husband sideways. He then looked back at his wife, and then at the same time, they looked at Eden and her husband. Eden says that she will always recall the almost frightened look that passed between the owners as they did so. Eden's hair immediately raised in the back of her neck, as the owners explained that there was no one in that room, and that they never actually booked anyone into that particular room. Confused, and thinking that maybe the owners were joking around, they asked why they never placed anyone into that room. And the owners told them that it was because there was just a very strange atmosphere in there, and that even cleaning the room, staff felt uncomfortable. When Eden explained that the noise sounded like a television being played very loudly, the owners also said that there was just no TV in that room. Eden and her husband walked away perplexed, and a little creeped out. In the end, they were quite sure it was a ghost in that room, and have never forgotten their experience. This show is made possible by people like you sharing their real-life experiences, so please feel free to contact me. Thanks for joining me on this creepy adventure. Until next time.